So this section, we're going to talk about kind of the implications of the Ukraine situation, the sanctions that have been imposed. This is a very, obviously a new and emerging topic, and there'll be some folks in this call may have some insight on this. So we'll share a few pieces of information around the energy situation, and then also talk about some comments that Fareed Zakaria and Paul Krugman have made about the likely, not only the economic impact, which is more what Krugman's talking about, but also the kind of the implications for globalization and international relations more generally from Fareed Zakaria. And so we've sort of extracted from their op-eds recently at some length, and we'll get to go into those. But we may be at one of those inflection points in history, hopefully not with nuclear interaction, but just the way that a lot of the trends of the last 30 years of sort of the increasing interconnectedness and linkages of globalization may be reversing. And you can see Putin is probably not real happy about how we're shutting down his economy. And we've sort of declared economic war on him to some extent. There's a lot more we can do. But also because everybody's so connected, that gives us a lot of power to shut off those links. And we also saw in the past year or two with supply chains going on, with supply chains being disrupted due to coronavirus, you're seeing some of this made in America or made in China kind of language coming back into the lexicon here. So we'll talk through some of those things, but curious what the group has to think about that, has to say about that. Some interesting implications. So a couple of things. First of all, let's look at the prices of gas. And the Federal Reserve database has this stuff monthly, and also we get inflation monthly. So these gas prices are a little bit out of date. So I've included as a red dot where the gas price is now, about $4.10 or so. But you can see that if you go back in history, adjust for inflation, that's the green line. This is not the highest price gas has ever been adjusted for inflation. I've heard that it set some records in terms of the nominal value of it, the dollar value, but it's not a crazy number. And in fact, we've had gas prices this high fairly recently. From about 2011 until later part of 2014, we had gas prices higher than this. So for 3 years or so during the recovery, later part of Obama's first term and his first part of his second term, very high gas prices. And there was sort of this, it started really climbing. If you go back to the Iraq War, it's been climbing pretty steadily after that. We had some places here where it was above $4 a gallon going all the way back to 2005. So not unheard of to be in this range. We've been lucky in that the gas prices have been fairly low. When you say lucky in terms of from a consumer perspective, not so good from a environmental climate perspective. We want these prices high to be able to get more climate change to some extent, but as long as energy prices are low, it's harder to make that argument. So again, we're not in a crazy place in terms of the price of gas, just high like it was a few years ago. This is an interesting way of thinking about how much a gallon of gas costs, and it's in terms of how many minutes does a production and non-supervisory worker have to work. And it was really, I really saw it on Twitter. It was somebody did it, Matt Iglesias, who's he was with Fox and he's on his own, I believe now. He writes Bloomberg pieces, but a really bright commentator on the world. You don't have to always agree with him, but he's very, very thoughtful guy. And he had this one on his page. Not sure if he came up with it, but it's 9 minutes right now for the production supervisory worker to buy a gallon of gas. So they make $26.94. You divide 410, the price, by $26.94 times 60 minutes, 9 minutes to pay for a gallon of gas. Also not a crazy number in terms of the price in the history. So the page before was the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. This is another way of looking at it, kind of using wages to see where you stand. So I thought this was pretty cool. Needless to say, gas prices in the U.S. are lower than the rest of the world. Less of the developed world for the most part. So we're in that $4 range. The global average is closer to $5. And then when you look at some of the other developed countries we sometimes compare ourselves against or evaluate ourselves against, you've got numbers that are $5. Numbers in the sort of the very developed part of Europe are closer to $8 because they tax the heck out of it. So when people complain, oh, our gas prices are up, yeah, but we're still pretty lucky. Our government doesn't whack us with the taxes the way the rest of the world does. Carl covered some of this earlier. I've got to get that link from you, Carl. I thought that was a great set of data. I've got to graph that a little bit more, maybe in one of our future presentations. But here are some things. I think we might have shared this previously, but just to repeat it, U.S. oil production sort of peaked in 2019 around 12.25 million barrels. It fell in 2020, fell again a little bit in 2021, at least forecast. And then, we probably got the final data somewhere around here. And then the 2022 forecast is coming up, but it isn't expected to get all the way back in terms of the full year production until 2023, but the monthly rate is supposed to get back to that pre-crisis level, I believe, later this year. So it's the run rate will get back, but the actual full year amount won't be there until 2023. And there's some commentary over here by a couple of experts, but one expert and then the data. But there was a big drop off under Trump, and now production's coming back at a pretty good clip. And the U.S. is the world's largest hydrocarbon producer between natural gas and oil. We don't think of ourselves that way, but we are. And that has some serious implications for what we're going to talk about in a little bit. If the world changes and gas prices and oil prices are much higher on a sustained basis, that might not be such a horrible thing for the U.S., depending on whether we tax those corporations that are going to be making a fortune or not, to be honest, how we use that money. So there's some background there for you on this. And also understand when you hear energy independence, that means our exports are more than our imports. We're energy independent, meaning in theory, if we kept all that for ourselves, we'd be okay. Now that's not that simple because there are different uses of these different chemicals and different kinds of gas and other things. But in theory, our exports are greater than our imports, and you can see it here. And by that's the measure that's commonly used to talk about energy independence. And we became energy independent, I believe it was 2019, on both, when you add in the natural gas and oil. I think we were independent on natural gas several years ago. And then the oil came along a little bit later when we did more and more of the fracking, I think. And then we got there. So we're still energy independent. We didn't stop being energy independent under Biden. I've heard some of that noise from the Republicans. It's just these numbers have changed where even though the production dropped in 2021 under Biden, the consumption dropped even more. We remained energy independent across both types of things, across the natural gas and the oil. So there's some good stuff in here. This is another chart. It takes a minute to absorb this chart, but it's this dark blue line is the net. It says, are you independent or not? More imports than exports would mean you are dependent, and more exports than imports would mean you are independent. This blue line is right here, meaning we got energy independent in that 2019 frame, and then we came back close to zero in 2021, 20 and 21, and maybe in 2022, maybe we won't be independent, but we're still so close to zero, and you can see this line is sort of fluctuating around zero. It's just a bad argument to point to throw Biden under the bus to say we're suddenly not energy independent anymore. We are extremely close to energy independent, whether you're a hair above or below that zero line. And this other part talks about crude oil versus other kinds of petroleum products. So we've been more independent going back all the way to 2010. Think of this as natural gas. And then the oil, we've been more dependent, and we've been getting down. We're still dependent, but getting closer to zero. You net these together, you're energy independent. That's how the math works, the language works. So any questions on that data before we go on to other things? If there's something going on in the chat, let me take a look. Yeah, I don't know enough about fracking to know how many years of reserves we got buried in the ground. I'll have to defer that to others.
Well, when I studied energy back in 1973, 74, we had 20 years of oil. And we always seem to have about 20 years of oil.
Yeah, we get better at finding that stuff. We dig deeper, right? They get better at finding it. Yeah, I mean, it sort of reminds, when you said that, it reminds me of this idea that robots are going to take over all our jobs, but throughout history, despite all these technological inventions and innovations, we add more jobs. So we'll see if maybe we'll be wrong and the robots will arrive and take all our jobs, but it hasn't happened yet. We got 10 million
before we had frac attack oil shale when the price of crude oil rose in the late 70s, and it was strip mining, and big bulldozers tearing up the whole West to pull up the oil shale and then extract the oil from the shale. Environmentally terribly destructive and expensive, which is why at a current gas prices, at what crude oil prices went to in the 80s, it was no longer attractive to attack the oil shale at that point. It wasn't until fracking came along that we could do it efficiently enough at a lower price of oil.
Yeah, Mark said that the fusion power has been 10 to 20 years away for 50 years. So we'll see how that goes. Yeah, I mean, you would think that the cheaper stuff has been found and it's going to get more expensive, but what keeps happening is the technology. And I would think that the technology keeps getting better and more efficient at digging deeper or finding stuff in harder and harder places to get. So as long as there's money to be made, they are finding innovative ways to get at it. And it's good and it's bad, and that it keeps costs down in the economy if you're able to have cheap gas at the same time. It doesn't help the environment. We just have never gotten there on taking the environmental concern more seriously and imposing the costs on the people that are creating those costs.
Yeah.
All right, let's keep going here. So we're going to go through some extracts from articles from Krugman and Fareed Zakaria that I just mentioned with. Well, I've got the article cited up there. How might the Putin shock affect the world economy? There's another one on Zakaria. If you don't watch his Sunday morning, Fareed Zakaria is what do they call it? Oh boy, it's got a catchy name for what it is. It's like Fareed Zakaria. I can't believe I can't think of what it is right now. Fareed Zakaria, what? Somebody help me with this. But he does his my take at the beginning, which is he reads off what is essentially his Washington Post op-ed for that week. And it's really a great couple minutes of television. If you don't record that and watch it, you should, especially now, because he is really bringing in guests that are right on top of these issues. And he had spent a fair amount of time with a guy from Ukraine in the middle of this one. He had Krugman on there this weekend, but his take was really good. We'll get into that too. So Krugman's saying, how much is this going to cost the world if we shut down Russia? How big a deal is Russia to the world economy? And his sort of answer is not a big deal. It's going to be felt, but it isn't that big a deal. Now, this assumes we're not getting in a nuclear war, talking about a conventional situation that resolves one way or the other. Either Russia backs out or they take over Ukraine. Either way, he's saying it's going to happen. It's going to hit the commodity prices because Russia is a major exporter of oil and also wheat. Russia and Ukraine are both big exporters of wheat. So there may be some commodity price impacts that are significant, and expect those, and we're already seeing it. Both the oil and the wheat markets have gone up. They've gone up in price. Carl mentioned the oil has come back down quite a bit, but they're both elevated, and they likely will be for a while. He said also that this is actually one of his charts. And some of this stuff changes like daily, hourly. So this was on March 8th. These sanctions do not apply to oil and gas yet. So Russia is still able to export a lot of it. Now, the U.S. banned the oil imports, but it's really hard to do because Russia can ship to one country, they ship to somebody else, and then we buy it and say we didn't buy it from Russia. So it's one of those things where how are we really truly locking down Russia so they can't sell their oil to anyone? We will see. But the market's based on the prices, which as of these very high prices, the $130 price that Krugman's pointing out here, which Carl pointed out has dropped to 100 again. we're probably going to see a lot of volatility with energy prices in the next few months while this situation gets resolved. And, I think this is a funny anecdote here. Shell bought a bunch of Russian oil at a discount, I think right before the ban went in. And then they said, whoops, sorry, we're not going to do that again. But so there's always going to be this financial incentive for these people, these bad actors, to go in and grab Russian oil. I'm sure there'll be quite a hot black market for it. It's really hard because oil is sort of this, you can think of it almost like all this oil gets poured into a giant vat and then all the other countries buy from it at a particular price. It's not as simple as these one-off bilateral deals. These prices get set in global markets based on how much supply and demand is out there globally. It's hard to shut somebody off entirely. He also talks about he's surprised a little bit at the size of the price spike because oil production by Russia, this goes all the way back to the 1970s, just isn't that big a deal compared to the world production now. It actually was more, relatively speaking, sort of, you can look at Russia as sort of flat, but meanwhile, the rest of the world has jumped quite a bit. He's saying, I don't understand why these prices are spiking so much because Russia's not that big a deal. The way I would answer that question is to say that when markets are really at that balancing point, adding a little demand or taking away a little supply can cause a really large price swing. And I guess and he knows that better than anyone, but he's just surprised. He thinks even then, realizing that he would think that it wouldn't be that big a swing, but it has been. And he does think that Russia will be able to get away from the Western sanctions. They'll be able to sell to China or to the Middle East or others because, again, the U.S. is buying from somebody that is an authorized buyer. Well, where did they get their stuff from? Can we really prove that none of it is sourced directly or indirectly from Russia? That's going to be exceedingly difficult. Another point Krugman wanted to make is that the world economy is a lot less dependent on oil. So how much oil is consumed per unit of GDP is what this chart is basically showing. And I think he said barrels per $1,000 of GDP. I wonder if that's, $1,000. And he's showing it here. So oil isn't as big a deal as it was in terms of the economy. There's a much larger service economy, for example, in the U.S., relative to the manufacturing and sort of the goods side than there used to be. And that's an example of why you're not using oil. Accountants are not using oil as much as other businesses might use it. He's also talking a lot in here about wheat. Food may actually be a bigger issue than energy because Russia and Ukraine are large suppliers of wheat. You could see a big issue there. And so you're seeing wheat go from a bushel to 13. In the U.S. and Europe, he's saying that we don't spend as much of it. We're a high income country. We don't spend as much of our income on food as really poor people do, where food is their main thing. And so inflation is going to hurt poorer nations a lot more, where food is a big part of the family budget. So that's an interesting insight there of who's really going to get whacked by these food prices. Not so bad in the U.S., but very bad in places that are poorer. And he's concerned for the politics of the U.S., meaning, and he's got a great sense of humor. If you follow Krugman, he's got it's a fantastic sense of humor. I just love it. But Russians obviously saying stop buying Russian oil, but then complaining about high gasoline prices is like an awesome hypocritical way of doing something. But leave it to the others to figure out the inconsistency of that argument. But this is exactly what Republicans are doing. It's saying stop buying Russian oil. Okay, good, President Biden, you did that. Right now, look at these high gasoline prices. It's likely to raise the inflation as well because the commodity prices going up, oil prices going up. As you know, oil touches a lot of other products. You need a lot of energy to create a lot of other products. And so it sort of is one of those things that doesn't just raise the price of oil, doesn't just raise the oil price. Oil raises the price of a lot of other stuff. You got to transport all these goods all over the country, and you need energy to do that. So these prices go up. One thing he points out too is interesting is the Fed focus on the headline inflation versus the core, meaning the headline inflation is everything, the CPI all, that's the 7.9% that we talked about. Core inflation excludes food and energy. And so if those are the areas where you're going to see a lot of inflation and you take that out, the core doesn't look quite as bad. And he's saying the Fed really looks at core. It considers food and energy prices to be sort of volatile. They swing around. They can go down or up. They're not going to direct their policy at that. They're going to focus on the core, excluding food and energy, which is good news. And he thinks that's a good thing to do. So a lot of good stuff there. Fareed Zakaria talks more about this idea of the post-American era, that if we've sort of been the world's police force and controlling kind of how things happen, in part because, obviously the dollar is a big part of it. We control a lot of the financial system, but also the globalization, the interconnectedness of all these parts of the world. If that starts to unwind, and that gives China and Russia a chance, let's say, to create a trade bloc or something and exclude the U.S. I mean, if you see more of a bilateral kind of arrangement rather than a more global kind of arrangement where countries sort of split off into alliances and sort of not saying build walls, but sort of build commerce walls where they're only interacting with certain parts of their bloc, then that could be something that causes inflation for the long run. Because in theory, if you're free as a corporation to source wherever you can get the goods cheapest and sell them at the highest profit, that efficiency that allows you, in theory, to get profitable too, but you can deliver at a lower cost. This is the Walmart way of approaching the world. They sourced in China and were able to undercut everybody else in prices. You'll see if you reverse that, you get inflation, or prices will be higher than they would be otherwise because the international system of trade is less efficient. And I think Fareed was talking about that, and you're seeing the metaphor that he talked about with I think is he called the premier of China. Chinese bowls should mainly be filled with Chinese food, and we talk about buy American, and Europe had Brexit, the UK dropped out, and so it's this idea plays well at home of saying, we're going to do everything here locally, and we're going to source American. It has a nice patriotic feel to it, but it means you're paying more money. We don't have it in here, but we shared this slide a while ago that President Trump, ex-former President Trump's tariffs cost a typical American family about $1,300 a year. That's an example of a reversal. You could see that continue as different countries unplug from each other. If that happens, then you could see a sustained increase in inflation rate over time. And that's what he's talked about here. You think about supply chain, the goal was to be just in time, meaning your supply chain was so reliable and the quality level of your supply chain was so high that as soon as you run out of raw materials or inputs to your production, the new stuff comes in. We got incredibly good at that just-in-time delivery, and now you're seeing all these disruptions in the supply chain. If you make your supply chain more resilient, meaning it can handle those kinds of shocks better, that means you're paying for a cushion. You're paying for more inventory. You're carrying more inventory. So you're going to see a lot of businesses that have higher costs than they would otherwise, and that is another way of saying that is if businesses are facing higher costs, generally price levels are going to go up. So he talks about that idea of resilience. If you hear that word, resilience meaning redundancy and more backup capabilities in your supply chain so you don't get whacked if there's a disruption, that's costly for businesses to do that. Energy will also be higher priced most likely, but also this idea that it may not hurt the U.S. that bad because we are one of the leading producer of hydrocarbons in the world, gas plus natural gas plus oil, and other products that in that sector, we're the biggest. So if those prices go up, in theory, we have but to tax them. And that's not so easy, as you know, but that is how the government can get at that wealth and how the citizens of the country can get at that wealth rather than leave it in the hands of the smaller, these enterprises. If we're not going to nationalize oil companies, then we tax them. So I thought a lot of really interesting insight about the unwinding of globalization, about new kinds of alliances forming with sort of a Russia-China bloc, it's a concern, but it's not as simple. There's a lot to that. And China wants to look, one argument that Fareed was talking about is China wanting to look more like a global leader, and try to portray at least a more moral approach, although they've got their issues with that, as you know, with what they're doing with some of their ethnic cleansing. But this idea that China wants to be on the world stage and be a leader, working with a country like Russia that's invading other countries isn't necessarily good for that image. So, to what extent are they going to try to maybe be a broker in this Ukraine-Russia war and try to bring it to conclusion, or are they going to just behind the scenes start feeding Russia all kinds of arms and sort of becoming more of the Russia-China bloc? We'll see if that happens. So lots to think about here, and I just quoting them because I haven't had really a chance to even form my own views on this. It's such a new area, but these guys are two of the best, so thought we'd share that. Any questions, or you guys want to chat about this a bit? Any comments and questions about what do you think of what they're saying?
Well, I hope they're right that they don't have too big an impact on us here in the U.S. at this war. Beyond that, I have no clue.
And this is some very big picture stuff, and it takes a while to kind of step back and say, okay, is this globalization regime really going to reverse? And I think that there may be some reversals in the short run, but I think it's probably overblown that all these companies are going to suddenly kind of unplug these very low cost areas of labor. I think I would think of this as more of a short-term disruption. I don't see globalization going away anytime soon because the profit motive is so strong. But I don't have a strong view on that, and that I could very easily be wrong. And you could see these political blocs formed and trying to reverse some of that. One thing I would certainly think the U.S. had better be careful about is if there are very strategic sources of stuff that are in countries that are at risk where that supply chain could get disrupted, we better act on that. And one example, Taiwan, where about 60% of the chips come from. And you've heard Biden talked about it in his State of the Union speech about Intel building a $20 billion factory or set of factories. I forget where it was. Is it Iowa? Idaho?
Ohio.
No, Iowa or Ohio. Thank you. So yeah, great. So they're going to build that. That's a good example of not only making your supply chain stronger, but realizing that you might not always have access to Taiwan. I mean, China could take Taiwan tomorrow, and I hate to say it, but our ability to really stop them is pretty limited. We could do militarily. We could do. I mean, it'd be like, imagine if we took Cuba, and China decided they didn't like it, and we're going to declare war on us. How the heck are they going to fight us on a short supply line like that? Plus, our Navy's enormous. But just the point is, it's their backyard, and it's going to be extremely difficult for us to fight over there seriously. But we can do a lot of the sanction stuff, and China's not stupid. They don't need to do that. It's just they could, and so we have to be thinking like that. Of do we need to? How much chip capacity do we have here? The other one that's harder, and I don't understand it real well, is scattered around in these odd countries are really rare minerals that are really important to high-tech manufacturing. And I think there's something in Afghanistan. One of them is in Afghanistan of all places. I think they're in weird countries. And how are we going to deal with that sort of a thing? So we have to be in business, they call it strategic sourcing. You source, if you're going to have a big disruption out of one country, you make sure you have redundancy in another. If Taiwan is where all the chips are being made, then we need to either make them here or find some place that's friendly that we can defend that can make them. If it's going to be Mexico, great. Let's do the factories there. But we've got to think about those kinds of security issues. And when you talk about security issues, then you tend to get into inefficiency. It restricts globalization. Businesses can't find the lowest cost provider, and therefore you pay more for products. Inflation that we've had that's been this practically zero, or not zero, but a couple of percentage points may wind up being 3 or 4 in the future, and not that. I'm wondering if this is an overreaction, but early days yet. But we'll see. We'll see if that continues. By the way, Fareed Zakaria did write a book called The Post-American World like 6 or 7 years ago. So when it says this marks the beginning of a post-American era, I do laugh a little bit. He may see the world in that frame because he's been thinking this, he's been arguing this for a while. So we'll see if it does happen. This is one of those forces that's sort of pushing in that direction. And we'll see. I think one thing that we're realizing and the world's realizing, and I think we're just getting our brains around it, is underneath the plumbing of the world is the financial system. You know, we think of the ships and the products and the real things, but this financial plumbing is all there. And the United States seems to have a lot of control over it, don't we? And that's why, you know, when you hear about the Russian economy just getting crushed, the U.S. hasn't even used all the sanctions that it has available. I mean, I think with this group, probably most of you have seen that movie? I'm going way back now, well, not way back, but to the 80s, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. There's that incredible scene where Bartertown sits on top of essentially oil, but it comes from pig poop. They use this methane factory underneath to run the power in the town. And the guy who's running, who's underneath and is doing this, gets upset with the president of Bartertown, who's played by Tina Turner, and he says, "Who runs Bartertown?" You know, he shuts off the power and he forces her to kind of confess that he really runs Bartertown. And so I thought about it when I thought of the U.S. basically shutting down that valve to the financial system and shutting off Russia. And that's what's happening. And it's interesting I haven't had a chance to kind of look at, here are the 20 sanction regimes and here's the likely impact kind of analysis. Maybe it's out there, I haven't seen it yet, but it's coming. The media will get to it. And right now we're seeing Russia really scrambling. I don't think as you keep hearing people say, either he didn't understand it or he didn't care that his economy was going to get shuttered for a while. I think he figured this will be over a lot quicker and that we wouldn't have time to kind of shut that valve off, but we have been.
All right, David, I'm going to interrupt you because we've got a question.
Yeah, please.
Jeanette, go ahead.
I just wanted to share that I recently was recommended a stock that is a logistics company that does what they call near shoring instead of offshoring. And I just feel like it connects to your concept of how do we create something other than just-in-time inventory. There's a way to do that if you have enough connectivity and enough data about all the different companies. So I like that concept, and I haven't bought it yet, but I think I will. Thank you. It's a wonderful conversation.
Okay.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it does. I mean, this has been, you know, if you study manufacturing, inventory management classes, they're all about, they have very elaborate models for how much should you reorder and when, and what they call it an economic order quantity. What should that be? And this idea of resilience and security coming back against sort of this pursuit, and I think Zakaria had nice words for it, but sort of the idea of everybody was after, that's what he said. He said everybody was after growth, you know, growth, lowering your costs so you can grow your economy. And going to the just-in-time way of thinking about the world. And he's saying, no, it's kind of reversing now. I think that's a fascinating observation. All right, other questions? What else have we got? What do you guys think? We got some smart people on this call. You know, your guess is as good as mine. I'm just repeating what smarter people than me have said. What do you guys think?
I guess I'm not expecting huge changes, but we'll see what happens. If 2 years from now, we'll see where we're at. See. You asked for the link to that U.S. oil production chart. I dropped in the chat a few minutes ago, so it's there.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
I was going to mention one other thing I dropped in the chat from a discussion from our last meeting about do vaccines help prevent COVID based upon a videotape, and I dropped a link to a CDC statement on that in the chat just before the oil stuff. And then, yes, jump in.
David, you asked the question, what do we think? So my response is there was crickets when you asked the question, is that the response is uncertainty. So what is the impact of uncertainty over a longer term in the marketplace?
No, that's a good observation. Yeah. And if risk goes up, costs go up, and you would think that typically, you know, you could see if people are scared, what tends to happen? They buy U.S. bonds, and you see the interest rates go up.
People empty the shelves of toilet paper on a whim.
Well,
No,
well,
seriously.
no, they do,
Good.
and you know, they start buying firearms and ammunition. I mean, all this stuff that people get nervous, they start doing that. I'm surprised I haven't seen more of the hoarding behavior, because the risk of a nuclear confrontation has gone up significantly. Now, it was a very small percentage likelihood before, and now it's still a very small percentage, but it's more than it was. And it's something that everybody probably crossed your mind at one point of, holy crap, what would I do if there was even a limited exchange? You know, what kind of world is that? I mean, but I said something wrong before, which is when people get scared, they buy treasury bonds and interest rates go up, it goes the other way. Interest rates go down if that happens. What I was thinking about risk is that if the world gets riskier, usually investors would demand higher interest rates for their investments, meaning before they'll invest, they'll demand a higher return or more of a guarantee, more risk-averse behavior. That would usually slow growth a little bit. If the world is perceived as more risky, not as many projects get funded.
Right. That's good.
So that's a way of thinking about it. And that uncertainty could, definitely it's there. Other comments? Believe me, there's nothing, not going to say anything dumb here. We're all guessing. So,
David, I just,
Yeah,
I had my hand up here, but yeah, so you were talking about manufacturing and just in time, and is there going to be a reversal on that? I don't know if there'll be a reversal, but it definitely has to be a rethinking of that. With a fluid international economy, maybe you could take a line being down for a day or 8 hours or maybe 2 days. But now with these kind of disruptions that are going on, this is sometimes weeks that critical material doesn't get to you. And I can just think back when I owned the manufacturing plants and we had the production meetings. We were always trying to squeeze down the amount of time it took between our supplier and us, and we really wanted the supplier to own that inventory, etc. But that risk reward is changing now. You could see today the news was in Apple that one of their big manufacturing plants is shut down now because the Chinese shut down an entire, I think it was a province due to COVID. 1,200 cases, they shut it down. For how long is that going to be? Probably 2 weeks. So now they're trying to, redeploy, ramp up in other production plants, etc. But that doesn't just happen by turning the switch. And so if you're a small U.S. manufacturer that has maybe several hundred vendors and half a dozen or a dozen of them are off-seas or offshore, you've got to reduce your risk, whether that is you're building your inventory on those strategic parts or that material, or you're going to a different material, which I'm going to suspect is where most people are going at these days. That's going to be the key, because you can't afford lines to go down. It's a crazy situation in a plant.
Right. No, thank you for that perspective. That's right.
Today there was,
because of COVID, there's been a lot of alternate sourcing going on, and they're actually reaching the capacity of many of these alternate source places to expand. Vietnam is building stuff as fast as they can because they are an alternate low-cost supplier. The company that went down for Apple is Foxconn. They are an alternate source operation production house for high tech, and they have plants all over the world. But the people who know how to build an iPhone, and it is a non-trivial assembly process, and the fixturing and test equipment and things like that, plus the supply chain itself, means that even if you picked up a Foxconn factory and tried to drop it in, they'd have to drop in all of the neighboring businesses that supply the whole environment. So it's when you get something as complex as an iPhone, or any of the big Android phones or anything like that. It's it's pretty pretty hard to move it.
It's also going to be fascinating when Russia basically nationalizes all of the McDonald's. How
Aren't they saying
long?
they're going to nationalize everything that ran away?
Pretty much. So it's going to be interesting how long McDonald's memory is.
Well, what I remember, they still want the plantations back in Cuba, and the casinos, right? Same
Yep.
guys, same rich guys want those things back from Cuba, and that's
Okay.
been what 75 years. And the other thing is, if there's any technology in it, how long are these seized assets going to work?
The planes probably have a couple of months
At most,
at most.
guaranteed.
Oh, I remember I heard something about that where Russia has an airline, but they get a lot of their parts or planes from U.S. or Europe. I don't know if it's the U.S., but they get them from Europe, and they've been cut off from that source. So a lot of their aircraft, their commercial aircraft, may not have the parts they need. They're not going to be able to fly around very much.
They seized $10 billion worth of foreign-owned leased aircraft that are in Russia. Most of them are Airbus aircraft that are owned by third-party lessors.
Yep. And what's even more fun is the moment those maintenance records go bad, those planes aren't salvageable.
Yeah,
They
and
are
the
a
other thing about
loss.
it is Bermuda canceled 775 registrations in Russia today.
Saw that.
Well, what that means is those planes are not welcome until they're re-registered somewhere in the non-Russia world. Those planes are not welcome in the world airspace. Now, maybe the Chinese would let them fly, but I doubt the Mongolians would, because if you were to become a bandito, a smaller company probably could not fight off the air registration system, the international air traffic system. China can ignore it, but and they do. So even if they could come up with a source for parts for those planes, in the black market or something, they can't go very far.
You might be able to get a strut for a wheel, or landing gear. You ain't getting a blade for a turbine.
Right. Yeah, GE wouldn't dare sell you one. Or
Nor will Rolls-Royce.
Yeah, because they would have a bunch of new executives very quickly.
Those are paperweights. Very big paperweights.
All right, we'll conclude here. Just a couple more slides, and then we will. The Republicans sort of gave us a gift, and we shouldn't let them forget it. They did this big brochure from Senator Scott that talked about raising taxes on people that are not paying income taxes, like the bottom 50% or so. 50% of people don't pay income taxes, or because they have very low income. That's not, I don't think it's 50, but whatever that number is, it's a large number. The people pay, of course, they pay payroll taxes on their wages, but income taxes, they're not paying any income taxes. So he said, let's tax all these people so that everybody's got skin in the game, apply an income tax to everyone, estimated to raise about $100 billion. Bear in mind that was about the year one impact of the corporate tax cuts under Trump, the first year. So if you think about, if you combine those two ideas, a corporate tax cut combined with raising taxes on the people that aren't paying them, you've got a truly gigantic wealth transfer of taking away $100 billion from the poor and giving it to 100 billion people, because corporations they funnel that money to investors who own 90% of the stock. So it's a very regressive approach that I'm amazed that they actually put it out there and give the Democrats a little help. But hey, let's take it. So here's a chart that shows based on the income group, and I've got the numbers of what is each income group on the next page. But this the bottom 80% would pay this tax. very little in that fourth quintile, that 60th to 80th percentile. Quintile being 20, 5 quintiles in the whole population, 20% each bucket. So this is the poorest people, and these are the richest people. They don't pay any more in taxes. These people do, because these guys already pay a lot. So this tax would be applied to low income. And obviously, Democrats should keep reminding the world that, hey, if Republicans had their way, doesn't matter how poor you are, they're going to find a way to tax you. And it's going to hurt, because you don't have, the lowest quintile doesn't have $1,000 to spend on, to give on income taxes. Gives you an idea. Okay, go ahead. Yep.
Just before you move on, I get it, and it hasn't, but Scott's tax hasn't really gotten much traction, has it? I mean, the Republicans just hold together. They don't comment. They don't, beat up on this guy, but it hasn't gone anywhere except through the media. And now, frankly, through this meeting that we're talking about this, because this is, I think, the only proposal we're seeing from the Republicans. But I don't know that this actually represents the position of the Republican Party. What do you think?
Let's pin it on them. Let's pin it on them.
Pull them through the knothole with their own words. Point at Scott if you have to, but who gives a shit? This is not. We're not playing gentlemen's rules here.
No, I get that, but I'm just saying, it's like the same thing that's foisted upon us for somebody who is an outlier in the, say the Democratic Party, who says something, and then
defund the police.
Yeah, and then that becomes like the position adopted by the Democratic Party, which it is not. So I'm just looking at this as the other side.
But her email.
You're answering your own question, which is pin it on them. They are smart marketers and pin that defund the police on Democrats generally and very effectively.
I'm not arguing that point. I'm talking about within this group right here.
Oh, right.
I'm saying I'm not talking about how to take this. Yeah. This is definitely fodder that can definitely beat up on them. But the point is
exactly
right. So we're in a complete agreement on there. My point is that they don't really agree with this.
We should run away from each other. Nobody does that. Nobody drives any wedges.
We should at some point, though, understand what is our own propaganda versus what might actually be true.
Yeah, that's all.
Right. That's right.
Right.
That's right.
We'll keep a logbook. We'll keep a logbook on that.
That's right. Very well put. And that's exactly right. I think the Republicans have not come out and said, because I'm not sure if they do anymore. They actually used to have a platform, and then they stopped it.
They don't have any platform.
What he wanted was the platform, and now I think I'm not sure they've come up with a real platform. So they had. Now, one thing I admire about something, I hate to say this, but something Trump did I thought was really, really excellent, and something that Scott did, is they had short, like 2-page, really nicely produced PDF brochures that are easy to share and you can cut and paste images from them. They were excellent marketing materials. Trump did it with his, I forget what he called it, something Bargain with the American People or something. It had a name with it, but it's a great short thing that Democrats, I've never seen it from Democrats, where we have our platform boiled down into a couple pages of key bullet points, and shared widely. And I think we can learn something from Scott's brochure and the medium he's using, if not the content. Obviously, we don't care for the content, but it's out there. Feel free to throw him under the bus and share it and blame Republicans as widely as you like. And here's some more data that's busier, that just has the details for us in this group, that talks about what is each group. What are the income ranges of the poorest 20%, less than 24,000, average 12,000, and then what the percent change in taxes. What they say here is this group, that poorest 20%, would pay $1,000 more in taxes. It's 8% of their income that would get hit. That's a large number. Share of tax change would be 34% of the taxes. They would be paying 34% of the share of that. So how much is each group paying? It's the bottom 40% that are paying. If you add these two together, 79, 80, almost 80% of it is paid by these groups. And the percent of that group that would get hit 80% of that group, 53% of that group. So it's a big tax on the poor.
Yeah.
I do think that Republicans often think that poor people are minorities, that all white people must somehow be rich. That's not the case, obviously, but on average, yes, the average white family makes more money or has a lot of other better looking economic statistics than the average minority family. But still, this is going to hit white people, and it's going to hit poor white people, which are, in theory, the Republican base. So this didn't make any sense. I think but it does inform you perhaps about how the Republican base thinks. In other words, Scott comes out and says, I want to punish the poor freeloaders. And without thinking that they might be poor freeloaders, a lot of people will be like, damn right, tax those people, tax those freeloaders. And they don't realize it's them. I honestly don't think people think through that. They don't think past the first bullet point that's put in front of them. Let's tax the freeloaders. Okay, that's a great idea. Let's do that. And then they're like, oh, there's nobody like us that explains that to them that says, dude, you're in the bottom 4, you're in that second 20%, you're going to pay through the nose for this.
Question,
never
David.
in a million years are Republicans going to do it. Go ahead, sorry.
If the minimum tax is at most $200 per household, based on the earlier slide, how do we get average tax changes that are higher than that in the chart that we're just looking at?
Okay, 2 different sources. This is the Tax Policy Center, and this is somebody else. These do not go together, but they're, I didn't think the analysis from the 2 think tanks would be horribly different. Let me see though. This says 1050 average tax change, and this one says more like 900 in the lowest quintile. So there's some differences, but directionally it's very similar.
Okay.
In the wrong direction.
They are.
And then for
They
the
are a
folks
little
that
different.
prepare tax returns on this call, how much is this going to increase the cost of preparing the returns for the poorest 20%?
I hear you. I don't know.
I don't know. Mark won't
Right.
charge anymore, but
Is it being sold on how much it'll increase the taxes of the wealthiest? The wealthy Democrats that they would hate.
no, because it's
Zero. It's pretty much zero in that it's really targeted at people that are not paying federal income tax, which is very much at the bottom. Cynically, I could say that there are some rich people that are not paying taxes and are not paying enough. But it's not gonna target that group. If it does, it's very little. And this one has some of the top 1% saying it's basically zero.
The message from Scott is that everybody's supposed to have some skin in the game. That's the
Right.
phrase. That's his phrase.
That's right.
Yeah.
So
All right.
even if the poor people have a higher effective tax rate than Warren Buffett.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, never mind the equality part of it. It's, let's punish some people. We'll see how it sells, but it's easy for us to drive a truck through and just say, and the Democrats have been, even on Twitter, they've been saying, they bring up the Scott tax plan about every day. It's on their daily rotation of, the Republicans are trying to raise your taxes, everybody.
They have a higher effective tax rate than Amazon.
everybody does.
Exactly.
Yeah, Jeff Bezos, he's living the life. He's living the life. One of the big challenges we're up against generally is there is so much negativity about this economy that, and I mentioned earlier, but inflation is sort of like the new but her emails. The media it's just soaking up an incredible amount of media attention, and they're not putting perspective on it like we shared in this meeting. People are really doing okay if you add in those government benefits and the big wage gains. They're not talking about that, or if you are, they'll say wages are up quite a bit, and that's buried 3/4 of the way down the article with one sentence, while the rest is about inflation. So they are definitely not talking about this. And I had a funny exchange on Twitter yesterday where one of the guys, Neil Irwin, who's a New York Times guy, was talking about how inflation, people don't realize that if they think the inflation's been bad so far, wait until all the disruptions from this Ukraine war come in. Really? And I made my usual I made a comment that basically said, hey, I'm more worried about the media not covering the truth, which is there's an incredible boom going on, and people aren't really suffering. They've got their between the wages and the government payments, they're doing great. And another lady who's from the Financial Times came in and said, and didn't like that comment. She didn't like that I was throwing the media under the bus. And she's a lady with a lot of followers, and she's a heavy hitter with the Financial Times. And she said, you know, her comment was, you know, we're not as worried about it. Indirectly, she said, we're not as worried about inflation right this minute. We're worried about sort of the inflation spiral. That's why we're covering inflation. I just told her I thought that was a really lame argument, that you could certainly be saying that, and that's not what you're saying. The media is not talking up how everything's fine so far, but we have this inflation risk in the future. They're talking about how inflation is punishing everyone, and it's the end of the world. And if you look at these numbers on here, people think job growth is terrible. They think the whole economy sucks, is what the polls are saying, even among Democrats. And so this group has more information than most and can share it with whomever. Write your senator. It doesn't take more than 5 minutes to write an email saying, hey, here are some statistics. Would you please have your team tweet this? You know, or have talk this up with some of your media contacts and have them actually cover the good news. I mean, try to get people try to get them talking about how good the economy is. And it's, you know, do your best, and you've got the data to do that. My thing is Twitter these days, but I should probably be writing some of my congressmen too, and say, you know, there's nothing stopping you from tweeting about the economy every day. Just have one of your interns just every hour start doing it, and then they can work together and, you know, talk to the interns and all the other rep offices and do the same darn thing. So this is but this just tells you that regardless of where you look, we are losing the war in terms of explaining how good the economy is. And that's something that should be reversible. I think Biden made some progress in the State of the Union address, but we are up against the media has slanted this playing field, and how we try to level it is a challenge for all of us. But you know, I'm doing it one media personality at a time. The Financial Times lady knows what I think, so that's good. But it's you know, we'll see if the media starts trying to change their tune around this, but they just seem to be, you know, they just think inflation is the story. Let's hammer inflation nonstop and ignore everything else, because nobody cares about deficits. You don't hear anything about the deficit being cut more than half. I mean, that would be a huge story under the Obama era, because even what they call a fiscal cliff, 1/3 the size of the one we've got now, was all you heard about in 2012. I think that's all I've got for prepared slides. One last one was a pretty good slide I thought they did on.
Aren't we missing something though? Aren't we missing something practical about the media? I mean, if it bleeds, it leads. Why is that true? You know, it's sort of our turn to be on the receiving end of this. I mean, if we look back a year, wasn't there some statistic that said most of us believe that something like 40 or 50% of the people who caught COVID were going to end up in the hospital, and the numbers were nowhere near that great. But many of us believe that because that's what the media was hammering.
I don't recall that story in the media.
What?
I don't recall any story like that in the media, and I never believed that.
Well, the stories in the media were just about how bad COVID was. Okay, this story is about how bad inflation was, and it's not necessarily based on how many people it's hurting and stuff. I mean, what the real overall numbers are. It's individual case of people who can't buy groceries or after that kind of thing, right? I mean, isn't that the way it works?
Right. They talk about the headline numbers, and then they interview 6 people that are dying because of inflation.
Yeah. Exactly. It's the same format. It's just they've substituted a different theme and you know.
That's a really good observation. Yes, it is. You're right. That's exactly what's happening. And how do you battle it? I mean, it's an uphill battle for us, but you know, this is what we do. So share your stuff widely and battle it.
I guess, you know, somebody said we should invite somebody from Durbin's and Duckworth's office to our next monthly meeting, or send them a copy of the video and the slides.
Yep. Yeah, I don't know who those emails are, but if you know I know how to send Durbin an email on his site, but I don't know how to send like a report like this to him other than mailing it. I may just mail some of these. I mean, that may be what it takes.
Does anyone know how to get more than a form letter back from Durbin, to be blunt?
Yeah.
No, I mean, when we've sent him letters, we've gotten form letters back that didn't necessarily have anything to do with the issues we raised.
Yeah.
The staff person.
The intern picked the wrong response.
Yeah, he pushed the wrong button.
David, I think that while they don't like attachments per se, you can probably provide like a link to the Google document and stuff like that.
Ah, okay. Okay.
You know,
that's a good idea.
Now that's how I send out typically the links to the PowerPoint is a link to the Google document.
So,
yeah, good idea.
So, David, there is another group, people on this group may be familiar with, called Truth Brigade. And so I take a lot of the stuff that I've been taking screenshots. I can go back to the slides that you guys graciously provide. And I take some of these select things and then I wind up tweeting them on Truth Brigade. And so other people who pick up that hashtag will then retweet it. And that is happening. You know, I'm not getting 1,000 retweets, but it does go further than just me. I just want you to know that there's another way.
Oh, no, good. I mean, what I found on Twitter is that the way you get noticed on your stuff is you put it on somebody famous's, you respond to somebody famous, like you respond to a New York Times commentator, or, or somebody like Paul Krugman or any of them that have a lot of followers and a lot of people read it, and they will see it there and then they'll share it from there. So
that's right.
You have a list of sort of key people that you follow and you drop your stuff there and then they'll see it. The Democrats and Republicans both have a lot of Twitter activity going on. There's one called, I think it's just called The Democrats. It's The Democrats. It seems to be their main one. There's also the Joe Biden, obviously the president one. You want to get in early. If you happen to catch one coming into your feed, you have a couple slides you want to share ready to go, and then you drop it in. If you get it in there in the first few minutes, a lot of people will see it. So there are tricks to getting it. Like if I share something, I might only get 10 people that see it. But if I on my own thing, even with I have like 1,200 followers or something, it's a small number. Krugman's got 4.3 million or something. If you put stuff on his, it's going to get seen, and that's one of the tricks for it. All right. So yeah, I thought this was a nice slide that the Democrats did and shared, and they do stuff every now and then. Another one that's pretty good is what is it? I was just looking at one earlier. It just bounced out of my head, but I'll add a list of here. One of the things I'll add in a future presentation is a list of good Twitter people to follow. Last thing I'll tell you is for the Economic State of the Union, I did a thread that had a lot of the slides that would have been as of last month. So a lot of the stuff that we shared last month were in this Economic State of the Union presentation. It's easy to cut and paste that to say, here's how Biden's first year went. And that'll probably be worth sharing for about another month or so until more monthly data in. But that one has a bunch of slides in it that we have from this sort of presentation. All right, that's all for the prepared stuff. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.